The violinist Efrem Zimbalist. There are many glowing things to say about him, and a few not so glowing things as well to mention, but without a doubt one of the great 20th century violinists, and certainly worthy of a video on my channel. So who was Efrem Zimbalist Sr.? He was a Russian and American concert violinist, composer, conductor and director of the Curtis Institute of Music. Efrem Zimbalist was born in April 1889 in the southwestern Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. He was the son of Jewish parents Maria, born Litvinov, and Aaron Zimbalist, who was a conductor of the Rostov Opera Orchestra. His violinist father was his first teacher. By the age of 9, Efrem Zimbalist was first violin in his father's orchestra. Then around 1904 he was taken to St. Petersburg by his mother and required special permission to stay there, being a Jew, which was arranged by Leopold Auer. At age 12 he entered the St. Petersburg Conservatory and studied under Leopold Auer, and also studied composition with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. He didn't go straight into Auer's class. He did preparatory work with Nalbandian, similar to Heifetz some years later, but was admitted into Auer's class in 1907. He graduated from the conservatory in 1907 after winning a gold medal and the Rubinstein Prize, earning him 1,200 rubles. He studied for a short while with Sevcik, and by age 21 was considered one of the world's greatest violinists. If you look at Henry Roth's book, Violinists from Paganini to the 21st Century, on page 257, you see that Zimbalist purportedly had some socialist leanings. I quote, "Biographers generally point out that Zimbalist was a red shirt leader of the conservatory student strike during the abortive 1905 revolution. However, his intimate association with extremely wealthy society figures dating from shortly after his arrival in America would indicate that Zimbalist was a realist in terms of advancing his career." After graduating, he debuted in Berlin playing the Brahms Concerto, and also in London in 1907. Another noteworthy performance was in 1910 when he played the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto at the Leipzig Gewandhaus under Arthur Nikisch. And then in the United States in 1911 with Max Fielder and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, when he gave the first American performance of the Glazunov Violin Concerto, another one of Leopold Auer's students in St. Petersburg, who probably would have mingled with the great composer Glazunov. In 1912 he played the Glazunov Concerto in a concert marking Leopold Stokowski's first appearance with the London Symphony Orchestra. Thereafter he settled in the United States and did much to popularise the performance of classical music in his adopted country. In 1917 he was elected as an honorary member of Phi Mu Alpha Symphonia, the national fraternity for men in music, by the fraternity's Alpha chapter at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. The frequency of his public performances began to abate after the 1930s. He retired as a violinist in 1949, but returned in 1952 to give the first performance of the Violin Concerto by Giancarlo Menotti. In 1955, he finished his career with the Beethoven Concerto, and then retired again. During his later years, he lived in the Reno, Nevada area. He did serve as a juror of the International Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow in 1962 and again in 1966. Starting from 1928, Zimbalist began his association with the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, taking up a teaching role. He became head of the violin in 1930 and then was made director of the Curtis Institute of Music between the years of 1941 to 1968. So a long teaching career there. And his pupils included such distinguished musicians as Lynn Blakesley, Aaron Rosand, Oscar Shumsky, Norman Carroll, Toshio Ito, Joseph Silverstein, Yasha Brodsky, John Daly, Michael Tree, Felix Slatkin, Shmuel Ashkenazi, Harold Whippler, Leonid Bolotin, Takaoki Sugitani, Helen Kwalwasa, and Hidetaro Suzuki. So some of his students are among the best of the American violinists, and we'll single out Aaron Rosand and Oscar Shumsky in particular from that list. What of his own compositions? These include a violin concerto, a piano concerto, the American Rhapsody, a tone poem called Daphnis and Chloe, a fantasy on themes from the Golden Cockerel by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, a fantasy on Bizet's Carmen in 1936, a piece called Sarasatiana for viola and piano. And he also wrote an opera, Landara, which premiered in 1956. Several composers also dedicated their works to Zimbalist, including František Dödler's Guitarrero, Victor Cousteau's Promenade Grotesque, Cyril Scott's Tallahassee, William Wielki's Chant sans parole. He recorded around 89 different compositions, and so could be described as quite a prolific recording artist, performing with musicians including Fritz Kreisler. And a small note on his political activity, Pablo Casals writes in his biography Joys and Sorrows that Zimbalist was a member of the Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy, chaired by Casals and founded by him in 1936. About Zimbalist's family. Zimbalist married the famous American soprano Alma Gluck, and they toured together for a time. Gluck was a divorcee and mother of the writer Marcia Davenport. Zimbalist was also an accomplished pianist and served as accompanist for his wife as she sang, performing with her on tour until her retirement in 1925. Sadly, she died in 1938. Then in 1943, Zimbalist married the Curtis Institute of Music's founder, Mary Louise Curtis Bok, daughter of publisher Cyrus Curtis and Louisa Knapp Curtis. And she was 13 years his senior. Zimbalist's son, Efrem Zimbalist Jr., was a fairly famous actor. We can see his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And their granddaughter, Stephanie Zimbalist, was also an actor, primarily in television. For example, Efrem Jr. portrayed Dandy Jim Buckley in Maverick opposite James Garner, and the lead characters in the television series 77 Sunset Strip and The FBI. Granddaughter Stephanie played the female lead in Remington Steele opposite Pierce Brosnan. Efrem Zimbalist also had a daughter called Maria Zimbalist. His religion? Well, although he continued to consider himself ethnically Jewish, he found himself attracted, along with his wife Alma, to Anglican Christianity, and they regularly attended the Episcopal Church in New Hartford. Efrem Jr. and Maria were both christened there, and the couple placed Efrem in an Episcopal boarding school in New Hampshire. Efrem Jr. later became active in evangelical circles and was one of the founders of Trinity Broadcasting Network. Efrem Zimbalist died in 1985 at the ripe old age of 95. So a couple of things that Roth says, Henry Roth, about Efrem Zimbalist in his legendary book, Violinists from Paganini to the 21st Century, he describes Efrem Zimbalist as one of the most sophisticated and intelligent violinists of his era. He says that he had a long and honourable overall career as a musician. Roth heard Zimbalist in concert and describes his playing as somewhat bland, and similarly his recordings. He does not rate Zimbalist's recordings or composition too highly, and in that Carl Flesch appears to be in agreement in his own autobiography. Nevertheless, Roth states that his influence on American violin art was considerable, and his overall contribution was of major stature. So you can read about this more in Henry Roth's book on pages 257 and 258. He also adds a detail there pertaining to Leopold Auer about the highly expensive cost of taking private lessons with Leopold Auer back in the early 20th century in America. This is quite an interesting little point, and it's under the section on Efrem Zimbalist, where Carl Flesch is basically knocking Zimbalist's teaching ability and Auer's, and reveals that Auer charged $360 for 6 lessons. $360 for 6 lessons, which quite a lot of money for the time. Kind of the mid to late 20s, I guess. So that's an interesting one. And now on to the violins of Efrem Zimbalist. According to the New York Times, Zimbalist once owned 20 rare violins and continued practicing the violin for 30 minutes daily up until some months before his death. That might be the secret to living long. Early in his career, Zimbalist owned the Titian Stradivarius violin and purchased the violin while on a trip with friend and world-renowned violinist Jascha Heifetz for $33,000. You can see some pictures here of Heifetz and Zimbalist while on their travels. At the time, around August 1923, the Titian was 208 years old and was made by Stradivari in 1715. It was ranked among the 4 finest violins in the world by European experts. The violin went on to pass into some other famous hands as well. So a great violinist of the Russian-American school, certainly worthy of a video in this channel, and whilst perhaps not one of the greatest ever violinists, certainly a good player and a great teacher as well.